Welcome, everyone. I'm Martin L. Shoemaker, and this is week 19 of our jazz sessions. We've been doing this now since the start of May. I'm seeing some new names here in the room, so I'm happy to have you join us. I'm glad, and I'm hoping that you'll like what you see and come back. And also, if you go to the QR code there up in the upper left, you'll find the recordings of all the past sessions. So, we are here to talk about making story models, visualization tools for your fiction. And today, this is the first of 4 sessions on this. Today, we're going to be looking at visualizations for characters and goals. But first,
This country, you gotta make the money first. Then when you get the money, you get the power. Then when you get the power, then you get the work. That's why you gotta make your own moves.
our little clip from Scarface there is part of the tradition we call paying for the soup. This is based on a quote from Edith Keeler in Star Trek, the original series, and City on the Edge of Forever. Now, as I'm sure somebody out there has said, it's time to pay for the soup. I am happily, gladly giving away these online writing classes. I'm not charging for them in any way, shape, or form, but it wouldn't break my heart if I sold some books out of it. So I always talk about 2 of my books before we get into the presentation. And usually the one on the right is Making Story Models, the book. But it's over on the left here today because we're actually going to be teaching from the content that went into that book. The book has got more dense text, but it's basically we're teaching the same material. So I put that one up on the left today, and there's a QR code if you'd like to get your own book and learn from it. On the right is an unusual one, which may not appeal to very many people, but it is a book on the Unified Modeling Language, which is a notation for designing and analyzing software through pictures. It started actually, this goes back all the way to 2009. I was trying to put together a conference presentation on UML and using it for communicating within a team. And I started drawing some pictures that started to look like comic strips. And I built a UML comic strip to explain my point. And then another, and then another. And over the course of a couple of months, I did 30 episodes of a comic strip all about teaching how to think and design in UML. And now I've got on the left here, a book on how to write in what is going to be largely UML, because one of the lessons that I learned in putting this material together is software and writing fiction have nothing to do with each other, nothing whatsoever. Because software is about users who want to do things and have to make choices, and things go wrong, and how are we going to handle those things that go wrong? And that's about software. And fiction is about characters and the goals they have and what they do about it and how that changes and how things go wrong. And is this really any different from the software side at all? If you have the right mindset, they're essentially the same thing about a user with a goal and what goes wrong along the way and what gets drawn into that. And we're going to start with goal diagrams today. But if you are in the system analysis and design world and you'd like a little different, less formal approach to design methodologies, my book, Ulterior Motive Lounge, is available primarily as an ebook. And it is a combination of comic strips to demonstrate points and then text explanations to teach the techniques in more detail. So normally I've got my fiction on the second half of this slide, but for this, we're looking at the lounge. All right. Some of you have been here before. You've seen this slide. You've heard this talk. For you new folks, I will always be trying to teach a mentality of tools, not rules. Anybody who tries to tell you that there are rules for writing unbreakable rules that you must follow and that you cannot succeed without following them is either naive or trying to sell you something. The one unbreakable rule I have for writing is you have to write. And don't let AI tell you that it'll do the writing for you, because what it will do is going to be writing that doesn't work. Now, maybe your audience is so let's say unsophisticated that they really don't care. But you really do have to write. Any other rule somebody gives you is like Goldman says, nobody knows anything. He was talking about Hollywood, but it applies to the creative arts in general. Not one person in the entire motion picture field knows for a certainty what's going to work. If it were a rule, you would have to follow it or you can't succeed. If it were a rule, if you broke it, you would fail. And anyone who didn't follow it would fail. There's not a rule you can point to that I can't point you to somebody who broke it, and I can't point you to somebody who followed it and completely failed miserably. Tools are interesting things to learn that you might use in a situation, and you might practice as a rule simply for the sake of trying to get better at doing it. But ultimately, there are no rules, there are only tools, even if you hear me call it a rule. Because I tend to speak a little bit in hyperbole and absolutes because I'm trying to emphasize a point. So I might call something a rule, still a tool. Anybody giving you rules is probably not really understanding the complexity behind the rule. But if they teach you, treat this as a rule, but there are exceptions, that's somebody who knows what they're talking about. All right, so here is a panel from Ulterior Motive Lounge, and we won't get into the nitty-gritty details on here, but this is a panel where I actually told a story in UML notation, and it is a blatant steal from Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, but it also is an example of visualizing a story as pieces of a system and how you interact with them. That's the sort of model we're going to be looking at. I will be talking about readers, but that means readers, viewers, it means audience. I will be talking about authors, but it can be all sorts of authors. And when I give you lists of things, it's not ever an exhaustive list. There's always more possibilities. So I just want to prep you for how to interpret some of the things I'll be saying. And if you are a math geek or a programmer geek, but especially the math geeks, I'm going to be treating some things as mathematical that really aren't. If you look at two scenes in two movies, you have a hard time mathematically saying which is the more exciting scene. So I'm going to be talking about some concepts that are not really measurable and graphable, but you can measure your interpretation. And so when I put some of these things down, if you're trying to be very mathematical and analytical and put numbers to some of these things, relax. It's concept, it's not hard numbers. It's not generally precise, although I have some examples of what I do in some of my practice where I can actually add some precision in this, at least precision in the discussion. So, if you're doing a talk on modeling, I think there's a law somewhere that says you must quote George Box. All models are wrong, some models are useful. The idea of a model is to help you think about a problem, not to be perfect. To be perfect, you actually have to do the work, not model the work. The idea of a model is low detail, like an outline or a sketch. Low detail of a high detail product that lets you think about the problem, scout for problems, and maybe also use it to study some existing system that you build a model of that to try to look at the simple version because the complex version's got too much going on. Again, The model will be wrong because those complexities have their own contributions to the problem. But you can think simpler when you look at a simpler representation. A model might be your plan for creating the final product, or it might help you look at what your plan was as you decide, but am I still going to follow that? It might be text, again, the classic textual outline, but it can be visual, it can be graphical, and that's what we're going to look at here. For those of you who, again, are new to these workshops, a little point, your questions are more important than my slides. My slides, we can look at those later. I'm going to have the whole thing recorded. If you get questions along the way, feel free to ask me when you have them. Not say, hey, I've got to go wait for Martin to come to a certain point or wait till it's done. If you get questions, shout out. I can't see if you do a hand raise or anything like that because I've got the slideshow running here. So speak up if you feel like you've got a question and I have led you astray and you're not sure where we're going. Now,
Martin, I do have a question real fast.
sure.
So as we go through this, because of you got so much experience and you've been doing this for a very long time. If you have personal stories or other stories that you know of where people use different models to write that story, could you provide that example? Like, for, I Am Carrie, or, like, so, somebody used a comic strip model to write their story, or because most models that I know of are someone just making a textual outline. But I would just, if you had, as we go through these slide by slide, if you know of an example, are you planning on listing them, I guess?
I will definitely be coming up with examples. I cannot say with a great specificity what other people have used, but I can certainly talk about models I've done, and I can also talk about how I might model specific things. But yeah, this is, I actually had a slide on this in the earlier version of this talk, the giant spoiler slide, which said, I'm going to spoil the heck out of everything because I need to make good examples. And to make good examples, I may have to tell you how the story ends. Because I want these models to be meaningful, not simple. Simple models are easy to teach, and you look and you wonder, but why? Why am I doing that? Okay, there's a picture of a stick figure. Why am I drawing that stick figure? There's actually a bit of a catch-22 that I ran into when I was teaching this for software, and sure enough, I ran into it again when I was teaching this for writing. I told you there are no rules. I'm telling you, you can do anything, anytime, anywhere. That's a lousy way to learn because you don't feel like you know what to do next. And when you've got a great big box full of tools, when do you use the wrench? When do you use the screwdriver? And when do you use the ohm meter? So there is a benefit to having me teach you a path to follow, as long as you recognize that that path to follow is one of thousands of possible paths. I am teaching a path to follow because it's a way to introduce the information. When I do my actual work, I am seldom, if ever, going to follow this path. I am going to think of what problem am I working on right now? What picture would help me solve that problem? So I will definitely be looking for examples on some of these.
Appreciate that.
But we are specifically now looking at visual models. And a benefit of visual models, one is that some people think better in pictures. It's just different people have different ways of looking at problems. But another is what I call the echo effect. If you give me a big page of dense text and I read it, I will learn less than if I read it and turn it into something else. It might be a picture because I'm doing modeling. It might be translating it into another language. It might be turning it into code. It might be turning it into an executive summary. Creating something with the information involves more of the brain than simply taking it in. So one benefit of creating a visual model is now you are engaging other parts of the brain than just your verbal centers. But then there's the echo effect. Once I have it translated by turning it into another form, such as visual, sorry, I just had a bug on my neck. Once you turn it into a different form, such as visual, it often highlights misconceptions. So in our little comic strips panel here, they all read the word apple and they had 3 different interpretations of what that word meant. And if they all said, so we're here to talk about the apple, they could walk away from the meeting thinking they're talking to each other and they're not. But if they drew pictures of what they think they've heard, the pictures, because they don't translate to the same pictures, highlight the miscommunication. So I call these 2 effects the outline effect and the echo effect. Outline makes you think more deeply to create something like a visual model, and echo because by saying it back to you in a different form, we will highlight misunderstandings. I'm doing a lot of general discussion of models before we get into specifics. I think this is the last slide of it, and this is the one that you're going to ignore. Once you start doing a lot of modeling and you're finding it fun, you are going to ignore me on this. And eventually, someday, you're going to come back to me. It might be years later and say, wow, you were right. And I'm not going to laugh at you because I've been there myself. One of the biggest mistakes that people make, in my opinion, in modeling, visual modeling particularly, is they try to put everything on one page. Everything they know goes on that one page. And it just becomes clutter. It becomes a blur. And pretty soon you can't tell that anything's there. Trying to do everything on one picture takes you down the path to every step on that path made perfect sense. But by the time you've got 500 steps on that page, you can't pick anything out. Now you can follow a path through that page. So path to point to point to point to point, and you can say, yes, that's all correct. But when you look at the whole picture, it's a blur. So I'm going to recommend that your diagrams be aimed at fewer things on the diagram. The old cognitive science rule is kind of less a rule than a guideline. Again, tools, not rules. But the cognitive science rule was you can generally keep track of 7 plus or minus 2 things on a page. Now you can do more, but you start doing things like grouping them. That over here, we have all of the villains' allies. And over here, we have all of the protagonist allies. And over here, we have all of the people working for the cruise line. And over here, we have all of the police. And you start realizing that what you've really done is you've got 4 things on that page, but every one of them is a group that has things inside of it. And so you start, by grouping things, you start sort of creating these units of comprehensible pieces. And so my preference is when I see it getting big like that, is I take the police off to a separate picture. I take the protagonist off to a separate picture and the antagonist to a separate picture and so on. Play around, find what level works for you. And the tendency is when you start seeing value in the models, you start producing everything diagrams until you start getting caught up by it a few times. All right. Now, we're going to be talking about stuff that will seem potentially formulaic. And especially when we get into part 3, they'll seem like it's formulaic, but you're here. Some reason you thought this was worth learning. So you thought that even with the concept of a model and a formula, you thought there was something to learn. And more importantly, doesn't mean you have to follow that formula just because you explored it. Blake Snyder and Save the Cat had this wonderful quote that changed my mind on him completely because I felt like the book was formulaic until I reached this point where he said, it's a trick he plays on himself. After he's done playing around with his beat sheet, he puts it away. He does without it. It was a scouting expedition. It was not a absolute ironclad straitjacket to control him. It was just a way to think through the problem. So if you're worried that you're going to end up with something formulaic, then when you're done, look at it and say, huh, that feels formulaic. What would I do to change that? So don't worry if modeling techniques feel like you're just signing up for a formula, because you will always put your stamp on it. But learning the formula is an example of what I call the how, when, why rule. How is your drilling? You are learning a technique. You are doing it and doing it and doing it until it becomes natural. Then when you start saying, I have this technique, here's when I'm using it and what I'm trying to accomplish with it. And then you get to the why, the strategy. So you start deciding when it's useful and when it's not. And I find that this is a good general learning progression in an awful lot of fields. That you are trying to first know you can do it and then know when to do it. And this is, I'm a fencer. I'm a really bad fencer. But I see this in learning fencing, that knowing how to do a parry riposte is not good enough. I have to know when. I have to know when that opportunity is coming. And if I do it when the opportunity is not there, all I've done is set up the opponent to disengage the parry and nail me. And so knowing when is just the next step of learning. But eventually, why? Why am I trying to parry riposte? Now, obviously, reason one is I don't want them hitting me. Reason two is I want to hit them. But beyond that is, hey, they are too close. If I do this parry riposte, even if it doesn't land, it will make them step backwards. And I need that room for what my next plan is. So the how, when, why rule is a way to get to that strategy level, to get to the point where you're deciding on the fly. So formulaic to learn isn't the same as formulaic to do. Like Picasso said, learn the rules like a pro, break them like an artist. And we're also going to be looking at models for two purposes. One is trying to plan a story. Another is trying to analyze a story and look for what's working and what's not, look for ways it's broken. So it's formulaic there because it is a technique you know how to use to analyze something. All right. Boy, I thought I was done with these slides, but trying to get all these principles up front here so that they're going to apply to all 4 weeks of this. Another common reaction I hear from people trying to draw their models is they're lousy at drawing. They tell me they can't even draw stick figures. And I got to tell you, I don't believe that. If I can draw that guy in the glasses on the right, you can draw stick figures. I didn't try to draw a good stick figure because I can't. I'm really a bad artist. But you can draw stick figures if you're not worried about perfection. And this is a real risk when some people are doing models, and any sort of model, not just visual models, but other sorts of models as well. They know the model is to help them avoid mistakes, so they're afraid to make a mistake in the model. They're so concerned with perfection that they don't know where to start. I'm going to give you some starting places, and later you'll find your own. But they're afraid of how to start because they'll get it wrong. It's like, of course you're going to get it wrong. When you sit down to write your story, you're going to get it wrong. You're going to do all sorts of things wrong as you learn to find your way and your voice and your approach. And getting it wrong doesn't hurt anybody. The most that getting it wrong hurts is time lost. One of the advantages of modeling is it takes less time to build a model than to build the whole book. So if you're concerned about time lost, Building a model and throwing it away is a lot less lost time than building a book and throwing it away. So don't worry about your perfection. You will get better with practice, and don't worry about making it perfect. If you just keep fiddling until it's perfect, you're going to be fiddling forever and never going anywhere. And then my very next line is keep fiddling. Huh? There's fiddling and there's fiddling. There's fiddling where you're trying to make it perfect. Every line straight, every bend in a line is 90 degrees, everything perfect, perfect, like I'm going to put it up in the Metropolitan Museum. You're not. But sometimes fiddling and just rearranging the pieces is a way of thinking about the problem. I can't tell what's going on here because all these things are clustered here. Why don't I space them out so I can see them better, see how the pieces connect to each other? Now, if you're going to do this, you might want to stop working with pen and paper because it's easier to move stuff around with certain tools. I will discuss tools a little bit. My tools are high-end software development tools, which I believe are currently selling for $289 per license. I'm not going to recommend these to you. I will talk about some others. If you happen to need them for your software development, however, they're a great way to model the writing process as well. But we'll talk about some tools. But for today, we're not going to worry about perfection on things. We're just going to worry about getting the picture down. So we've got 4 weeks of this. Today, we're going to talk about characters and goals. Next week will be people, places, and plots. Week 3 looks kind of unbalanced compared to the others. We're going to look at fortune graphs and beyond. I honestly think it will end up being approximately the same length from past experience, but we'll only find out by doing it. And week 4 we'll finish with some other classic models and where they're used and how they're used. All right. And again, just a note that if you're a programmer, take a look at this book. All right. Finally, we get to the actual first diagram. We're going to call these goal diagrams. If you're a programmer using UML, we call these use case diagrams. Don't pay attention. When I start speaking UML, just laugh at me. We're trying to speak like writers to writers. This is a goal diagram. This is a character. And I can't get the with goals. Just trying to draw on the slide and there it is down here. So now this is a character and it's still not doing it. Come on. This is not going to work well. Oh, well. I won't worry about drawing on the slides until we really have to. But this is a character with goals. Now, this is a character from one of my all-time favorite intellectual properties, Superman. This lets us map the character's intentions, motivations, interactions, what we call goals. We have the character. Now, to keep it simple, we draw stick figures. Now, if you want to dress your character up and give him a cape and an S shield and whatever, fine. You do whatever makes you interested in building the model. I'm a lousy artist. If I try to add the cape and the S shield and everything, I'm going to make something ugly and harder to read. So instead, I just put the name underneath. That stick figure is Superman. Everybody knows who that is. And the bubbles are the goals. He wants to find Lex Luthor. He wants to deliver the story to Perry, get a date with Lois, and feed Krypto. At this point, we're a fairly simple goal diagram. Very simple. But we're very early in. But it's already told us what his priorities are right now. And we have arrows now going from Superman to each of his goals. So that is a very, very introductory goal diagram. Hello. I'm trying to go forward. There we go. But Goals are short-term and immediate. Goals have motivations. He wants to find Lex Luthor because he wants to save the world. He's not finding Lex Luthor for lunch. He's finding Lex Luthor because Lex Luthor is a threat to whatever's going on in the world. So the goal, the motivation lies behind the goal. We draw an arrow from the motivation to, or from the goal to the motivation to say, this find Lex Luthor is because save the world. So it connects the goal to the motivation. I don't know why it says motivations there. That's a typo that has survived, I swear, 4 different places in here we get motivations. Kind of almost feels like an interesting neologism. That motivation is the motivation for why you go. Either that or I just had a typo that just survived and survived. I drew that arrow for a very specific reason, which you don't care about. Why the funky arrow with the triangle head? It has meaning in the unified modeling language, which basically amounts to save the world is the general thing we're trying to accomplish, and find Lex Luthor is a specific thing we're doing to save the world. You know what? If you forget which arrow is which and just draw arrows and you use them to communicate, I don't care. I just don't care. The specific arrows cause people to get into arguments about what's the right arrow here. It's like, did we all understand what we meant? Yes? Then draw that arrow and move on. Sometimes programmers in design meetings can be incredibly nitpicky over things long past the point where everybody agrees what we're doing, but you didn't do it my way. Not that I'm complaining about programmers after all, because I'm one, but we can be really, really cranky and fussy sometimes. So you can add motivations for any of your goals, but you don't necessarily have to add them for all of them. If you go overboard, you end up with something that starts looking like an everything diagram pretty soon. Do we really need a motivation for why he's feeding Krypto? The motivation is Krypto needs to eat. Okay, that's why he's feeding Krypto. But finding Lex Luthor's got a reason behind it. And we might even have deeper motivations than that. Why is he trying to save the world? And this often gets lost in your casual, mundane Superman story. In the back of his head, he already lost a world. He really lost a world and everyone on it. When he's trying to save this world, it's because he experienced losing one. He understands that at a deeper level than just about anyone else on the planet, except for various superheroes that are part of the same universe. But for most of us, he feels that potential loss of the world deeper than anyone else does. So you might have motivations for your motivations. Again, don't go crazy on it. And you can even have multiple motivations for a given motivation or goal. So yes, one reason he wants to save the world is he doesn't want to lose another home planet. Another is he was just raised this way by Ma and Pa Kent. They raised him with a simple principle. There is a right and a wrong in the universe, and the distinction is not very difficult to make. That is raised into him from before he could talk. So he has multiple motivations. Again, don't go overboard. Because if you go overboard, you start getting into, oh, wow. So he wants to save the world and he wants to redeem Luthor. Now, this is, for those of you who are not deep comic book geeks, comic books are generally aimed at about a 15-year range of readers. Some of us stay with them our whole lives, but generally they've got a range of about 15 years that they want to get all the money they can get out of those kids before those kids move on to something else. And so every 10 to 15 years, they kind of rewrite everything from the start because they've got a bunch of new kids they want to bring in. So we call these different continuities. And there are some continuities in which Superman and Lex Luthor were friends when they were teenagers. And it is one of Superman's great tragedies that Lex grew jealous of him and turned evil partly out of that jealousy. And in those continuities, Superman never gives up on the idea that maybe he can redeem Luthor and have his friend back. So here is a more complex diagram, but we could take this way too far. Kirk to Uhura in the episode The Trouble with Tribbles. Too much of anything, Lieutenant. Even love isn't necessarily a good thing. Notice how I've broken the 7 plus or minus 2 rule pretty badly here. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. I've got 20 things on this diagram. How many of them stood out to you when you first saw it? To me, what stands out is I got this group of stuff at the top, and this group in the upper middle, and the group in the lower middle, and then a bunch of stuff at the bottom. And I really have to dig in and pay attention to see what all those pieces are. So for me, I would make the first diagram, which has just got find Luthor, story to Perry, play with Krypto, date with Lois, and then take a separate diagram for find Luthor and all of its motivations, and a separate diagram for story to Perry and the motivations, and separate for Krypto and a separate for Lois. It is a good argument for tools as opposed to simple paper and pen sketches, because with tools, if I were to change Krypto's name to Bob, all the diagrams would change automatically because it's a power tool. If I'm doing this by hand and I change Krypto's name to Bob, I now have to go manually touch each diagram to change to Bob. And what are the odds in a really Krypto-focused story that I'll catch all of them? Not good. So again, we'll talk about some tools eventually and talk about ones that might be better suited to a more writerly budget than a programmerly budget. So this is a good diagram for understanding Superman's motivations in serious depth. There are definitely fans of the character who, like me, grew up with him. I've been through probably 5 or 6 continuities because I'm one of those ones who never stopped reading the books. There are definitely fans, but there are also those who aren't fans. And one of the things is they think Superman is a boring character. He's just the Boy Scout. And you look and say, there's a lot of stuff going on in this guy's head. This is not just the Boy Scout. This is a character who's got a lot of things that a good writer can look at any of these things and start saying, how could I turn that into a conflict in a story here? So creating a massive goal and motivation diagram like this might be useful for a character, but do you really need it for every character? Do I really need it for villain of the week? Do I really need it for Krypto? I mean, Krypto's a fun character. I love, if you haven't seen the new Superman movie, Krypto is the star of the show. So I love Krypto. But Krypto doesn't have a whole lot of depth to the character, at least in any story other than some weird special animated stories. So trying to do this goal diagram for everybody can take a long time. You'll go into as much depth as you think you need to understand this character. This is why I like to sort of iterate on these things of, if you're seeing that you don't understand a character more, go back to their goals and explore them. Go back to their motivations and explore them. Questions on goal diagrams so far? Anyone? All right. Then let's start adding stuff going on. Now we're adding participants to an individual goal. So Superman, when he delivers the story to Perry, he submits, and you see an arrow going from the goal to Perry. Say, hey, I'm giving you this story. But notice Jimmy's also participating because Jimmy is delivering the photographs for that story. Adding participants now starts giving you an idea of how these goals happen, how they take place in terms of other characters around. So an arrow from a character to the goal, like Superman to the story and Jimmy to the story, says, hey, I am contributing to this goal. An arrow from the goal out to somebody, like from deliver story to Perry and out to Perry, is showing that someone is receiving something as a result of this goal. And we had this picture. Come on. Come on. Come on. Stepping back a long way here. When we had this picture, deliver story to Perry, you can kind of understand what Superman is doing at the top level in that goal. He's creating the story and delivering it to Perry. But when you get down to this level, where we're looking at the delivery here, if I didn't put photographs on Jimmy's arrow, would you really know what Jimmy is doing in that story? Jenna Ita has joined the waiting room. Hello, Jenna. Thank you for joining us. Jenna, of course, along with Dawn Rayaman, are organizers of FireCon, my favorite writing and art conference, where in fact we first presented this workshop. I forget which one that was. It was FireCon 4, I think. So this is material that exists in part because they said, yes, please teach that. So if you enjoy what you see and if you enjoy the book, make sure to thank Jenna and Dawn Ray for kicking me to make sure I did it. So by labeling Jimmy's arrow, we are seeing something about how Jimmy participates in this. By labeling the arrow out to Perry with submitting the story, we're seeing how he participates. Now, you might have guessed, since the goal is deliver story to Perry, you might have guessed that, hey, what he's doing is submitting a story to Perry. But Jimmy's role in it, by adding a label onto the arrow, we get more specific about how he's participating. Hello. Hello. Now, at some point, you can start to wonder who is actually owning this goal, so to speak. So when Superman's finding Lex Luthor is trying to elude him. And we see Perry and Jimmy and the story and the date with Lois. Lois is a busy person. She postpones the date, and Krypto is playing. This is a complicated goal diagram in that it has multiple goals for him. Identifying whose goal it is, there are a couple of different ways you can do it. One is you can simply add a boundary. We create this box around the goals and label it Clark's goals. And that says, hey, if I had put Jimmy's goals here in the box, then we'd probably draw a whole different picture with Jimmy and Jimmy's goals of photographs and get a date and stay out of Perry's way and other goals for Jimmy. So that is one approach to put the boundary around it. If you are going to ignore me and do an everything diagram with goals for every character all on one diagram, and you can survive the headache this is going to give you, it could be really useful to group the goals in boxes for each character's goals. So that's one approach. Another approach is simply a convention. We, in the Anglophone languages, generally speaking, read left to right. Superman's on the left, the goals are in the middle, the participants are on the right. And so by virtue of how I've drawn this, most English-speaking people are going to assume these are Superman's goals. Other languages that read right to left will find this non-intuitive. They might draw the diagram reversed. All right. So when we talk about our contributors, sometimes I like to just visually show who is contributing something to it. Besides the fact that I say, hey, Jimmy is sending photographs in, I specifically use a little plus symbol that says Jimmy is adding to Superman's goal. So the plus symbol lets me see who's a contributor. It's less clutter sometimes than the boxes. So if I had this picture, I could, instead of putting a big box around, simply put pluses on everyone who is doing something as part of the goal. And we don't need pluses for Superman because they're his goals. Plus, once we have that notation, and if you know unified modeling language, I've just abused the notation horrendously. I took what was there. The plus means something entirely different in code, but it's a useful thing here. And once we have it, we can add minus for detractors. So when Lex is trying to hide from Superman, that is a minus to Superman's goal. That is a detractor to the goal. And all of a sudden, we now have a way to show opposition to the goal as well as contribution. And it might sometimes be opposition that is not intentional, but in terms of the goal, the intention is less important than the effect. A very classic example, which you just don't see anymore unless you're watching old TV reruns. But I do watch a lot of old TV reruns, and it's amazing to me how often this happened, and we just took it for granted back then. The detective, maybe it's Jim Rockford, runs to the telephone booth to call the police because he's got to tell them what he just learned. And there's a person in the telephone booth gabbing to their aunt. Is that person intentionally blocking that call? No. Are they Rockford's enemy? No. But they are a detractor from that goal. And so if we have pluses and minuses, it becomes easier to tell who is helping and who is hindering. We can also sometimes have multiple ways of contributing or multiple ways of attracting, of hindering. So Lex Luthor doesn't just hide. He lays a false trail, he sets a trap, and when he's finally still caught, he attacks Superman with his magic Lex Luthor supersuit. I was surprised they didn't do that in the new movie. I thought for sure it was coming, it didn't, but maybe in a sequel. But by being able to label each separate arrow of what Lex is doing and the effect, the pluses and minuses and the different arrows help us see a much richer picture of the goal. Again, if you do too many, you can go overboard into an everything diagram. You might even have a case where a character is both contributing and detracting. So suppose the guy who is hanging on the phone finally is like, well, okay, I get out of the way, you need the phone. And then he's listening in on the call and he says, oh, hey, I saw that guy running over there. So you might have one character who both detracts from and contributes to a particular goal. Again, you can go overboard. I don't think this one is too bad. I don't feel like it's overboard here. We have Finding Lex Luthor with a bunch of detractions. We have Deliver the Story to Perry with a contribution from Jimmy. We have Trying to Get a Date with Lois. Lois is detracting here because she postpones the date. And Playing with Krypto, of course, Krypto is contributing on that. But you just got to focus. Again, the everything diagram. Now I've put in all the different motivations behind those. I've put in place all of the arrows, all of the connections, and it just is starting to become noise. So again, I'm going to encourage smaller focus diagrams, which are easier to create and easier to read, so you get more communication out of it. Come on. Come on, come on. So here was our everything diagram on the left. And instead I produced this overview diagram. And then I produced the Lex diagram. And then I produced the Perry diagram with Jimmy. And then I produced the Lois diagram. And then I produced the crypto diagram. I feel like we get better communication with these focus diagrams with the everything diagram. And I say that knowing you're going to draw the everything diagram anyway, because I know I did. I had to learn through hard experience that when there's too much on the page, there's nothing on the page. Okay. We might, and I specify might because I don't do this often. I've got other ways to do this. But if you've got a fairly simple set of steps that you will do as part of a goal, you might actually list them inside the goal. Now, the result here with the tool I'm using looks pretty ridiculous because now that goal takes up most of the page. But it kind of does because we're trying to describe exactly the steps that Superman goes through for delivering the story for Perry. So he has to check with his sources, send Jimmy out for the photos, writes a draft. Then he has to confirm his draft with his sources because he is a diligent reporter. He gets his photos from Jimmy, puts this draft together, sends it to Perry. Perry sends back revision notes, and then Superman sends his revisions to Perry. Now, that just became too big to be useful on a diagram, in my opinion. But if it were, say, 3 steps, it might be useful. If I want to just give a kind of a quick heads up, I might put it in. I don't do it a lot. I have other ways, partly because of the tool that I use. And here's an example where my tool, I won't say it pays for the $280, but it kind of almost does. In my tool, I can click on that goal bubble, what we would call in UML a use case. I can right click and say, stick a diagram inside of this or stick notes inside of this. So the diagram or the notes don't have to be part of this picture, but they're accessible through it. That's the power of a tool versus just a whiteboard. A whiteboard, on the other hand, is cheap and easily accessible and everybody knows how to read it. So we might add points to a goal. But I'd be inclined to simplify it. Like I said, this is one I'm likely to actually use. So I'm not going to write all the 9 steps or whatever it was. It's write the story, get the photos, submit it to Perry. That's enough that I might put that onto a diagram to say, this is what his plan for his day is. And then go and do the same for some of the other goals. So adding a few points gives you an idea of what the character is going to do. But you don't want to do that for every goal. You don't want to do that for the parts that are the main part of the plot. I'm not going to write points inside of play with crypto. We really don't need for this model details of how he plays with crypto. Let's leave that to the director and the actors when they're actually performing that up on the screen. Play with crypto is enough detail. Delivering the story to Perry, you need just a little bit of knowledge of the newspaper business, and you don't need these 3 either, because that's what would obviously happen. But maybe you're going to put them in. They can be useful in certain occasions. For me, I'd rather go to a list, not on the diagram, but a separate list or a separate diagram. Now, actually, I think it's going to end up a little short, but it's a good place to be ending up. Just like we can have points of what happens inside of a goal, we can also add traits to a character, things that describe that character. So here, looking at Superman, we know he lives in the Fortress of Solitude. He also lives in 344 Clinton Street. My God, I still remember that from 1978. I remember Clark Kent's address in Metropolis. Why do I still remember Clark Kent's address 50 years later? Age 37, that's by official sources that Superman in the comics, do they still have this rule? For a long time, the rules were Superman is always 37, Superboy is always 17 or 16. Again, the detritus of pop culture in my brain, sometimes it just feels like it ought to bury me. He's got his super strength, super speed, flight, invulnerability, super hearing, X-ray vision, heat vision, telescopic vision, microscopic vision, photographic memory. There was a long period of the comic books where there was a mentality at the publishers that Superman had to be the best at anything. So anytime some other superhero had some power, they ended up giving it to Superman. I did not put super disguise artist on here because they've kind of forgotten that silly one. I did not put super breath on here because they had forgotten that one, but apparently super breath is back in the modern comics, that he can inflate his lungs and blow people over like a giant tornado coming out of his mouth. I'm saying this about a guy who can lift planets and mountains, but that's too silly for me. So you might add traits to your character, things to help remind you of what the character can do. But if you go overboard, which I kind of have done here, at least for anybody who knows Superman, I've gone way overboard. It just becomes clutter. Again, if you're doing a particular diagram, I would only list those traits that are relevant to it. So if the diagram is searching for Luthor, I might list light and super hearing and telescopic vision on there. Also, he has at the bottom writing because he is, after all, a newspaper reporter. In some continuities, he is also a failed novelist, which is a nice touch that even Superman can't guarantee that people are going to buy his book. So you can add traits to a character to help you say things about the character and what's going on with the goals. You might also then start to draw how your characters relate to each other. Now, we stepped away from Superman for this one. I could have done a Superman one, but I thought this was more interesting. I took this from a workshop I did for FireCon called You Know My Methods. It's a mystery workshop, and maybe if I keep going on the jazz sessions, we'll get to do the mystery workshop at some point. But one of the big examples I used in that mystery workshop was Beverly Hills Cop as a mystery, as a actually very solidly constructed mystery with a linear plot. And I'm off in the whole other talk that we're not doing right now, but it is a linear plot. At no point during that plot do you ever doubt who the villain is and what they're generally up to. It is point to point to point to point to point. Axel never once takes a misstep, because the purpose of that particular movie was we want to do action, adventure, high stakes crime with Eddie Murphy improving as many funny lines as he possibly can. So we're going to write a script that is bare bones mystery, and Eddie's going to fill in the rest. So it could have been a more complicated plot, but it fit the basic definition of a solid mystery. And part of that was the character network that I drew for that workshop. That we have Axel, our detective, is sort of the start of everything. He works for Inspector Todd, who is an antagonist. Now, he's not an antagonist in the terms of the villain, but he is an antagonist in terms of getting in Axel's way. He has two classmates, Jenny, who's an ally for him in what happens, and Mikey, who's the victim who dies in the first reel, early in the first reel. Jenny and Mikey are therefore also victims. Jenny works for Maitland. Mikey worked for Maitland, past tense, because of course Mikey's dead. And this is where the plot is again very linear. As soon as we meet Maitland, there is no doubt he's the villain. I love this movie, and I can nitpick it all day long. There is no doubt he's the villain, because instead of ignoring Axel and let him just go away and jabber off to whoever he wants to jabber off to, no, we got to have the security detail pick him up, take him out to the front, and throw him through the glass window so that the Beverly Hills police can pick him up and take him away. I was like, you could not do a more villainy thing, and you could not do something more prone to make Axel want to keep chasing down what's going on. Because they didn't, it's hard to do a really deep mystery in a 90-minute or 2-hour movie anyway. There's only a limited time to do red herrings and dead ends and so on. But Maitland left us very little doubt. In the meantime, we have Zach and Casey, two partners, both of which work for Maitland, and Zach kills Mikey. And we don't have any doubt about them either because we watched it happen. So we already know Zach and Casey are the bad guys. So there's, again, not a whole lot of doubt going on here. Meanwhile, we have our separate group over here, the police. We have Taggart and Rosewood, partners, who started out as antagonists for Axel, ended up as allies. They work for Lieutenant Bogomil, who also starts as an antagonist, but when Axel proves he knows what he's doing, becomes an ally. Bogomil works for Chief Hubbard, who's pretty much always an antagonist, unless you want to interpret the ending in such a way that Hubbard knows he's being led by the nose, and he goes along with it for the sake of having a good collar. I could see that one either way, but he certainly seems to come across as an antagonist. This is an example of a character network where you are just putting your characters down. Now you're not worrying so much about their goals. You're just worrying about who has connections to who and what are those connections and how might you use those connections in the pursuit of a goal. And might those connections imply goals? Might those connections lead you to goals you had missed before? So it's kind of a goal diagram without goals. It's just the characters. Show us how they meet, how they interact, and it might also give you gaps. Because if we go back to this original, as I drew this, trying to sort of show the two sub-networks, I didn't connect Axel to the others at all. I've sort of described how they're related, that we have antagonists, allies, 3 of them, but I didn't draw an actual connection. So I've missed that part of what the character network is. So I might redraw this to put Axel in the exact center of the diagram and then have everything else come out in sort of a star relationship around him. So that's a character network. This in the original, and I didn't pull it out here because it's something I want you to think about for yourself for next time. Take pen and paper or whatever, whiteboard, draw some goal diagrams. Take a story that you know well. It might be a favorite book. It might be your own work. Take the protagonist, draw a goal diagram, and then add motivations, and then add participants. And then after you've done enough of this, start creating a character network. Questions on that? No questions? All right. In the workshop, that little picture down there at the bottom, the 4 minutes, 59 seconds, was an actual clock to time things. And I quickly had to turn the sound off. But I have a 5-minute video of my kittens at that point. They're now big boys. But my kittens playing and fighting for 5 minutes to distract people when they were supposed to be doing the exercise I'd assigned them. So here is Larry and Jerry in their kitten stage playing around the house. So for next week, and if we get some time, I'll want to look at some of your examples if you want to share them. Take that work that you think you'd like to explore, your own or a favorite, draw the goal diagram, maybe draw goal diagrams for multiple characters, turn those into motivation diagrams, add participant diagrams, and then draw your character network. And then I'm going to do just a small step into next week when we talk about objects. The boxes aren't stick figures and they aren't bubbles. Stick figures are characters, bubbles are goals or motivations, things they want to accomplish. The boxes are things that are used in these goals. And we're going to see a lot more about those next week. But we're saying, hey, a story gets created in this goal, and photographs are used in this goal. And we'll talk about the different arrows again. If you don't want to use the dashed arrows, they have special meaning to me. They don't have to have special meaning to you. So your goal diagrams added to, or your objects added to your goal diagrams show what gets created. That's an arrow coming out. And show what gets used. That's an arrow coming in. And so you have that added onto your goal diagrams. And we'll talk a lot more about objects and object diagrams next week. Your characters can be related to particular objects. So this says that Jimmy snapped those photographs and Superman wrote that story. And we may see some diagrams coming up where we specifically look at just the objects a character works with, separate from the goals of why they work with them. So those are not necessarily as complicated as goals. You're simply saying, hey, these are things I work with. All right. But we'll get looking at a lot more about objects next week when we're looking at specifically people and places and plots. And that's what we're going to look at in making story models next week. Then after that, the 28th, week 3, we're going to look at Vonnegut fortune graphs. And we will be amused because Vonnegut came up with this technique that I love and then came to the conclusion that it was useless. And I'm going to have the hubris to say that Vonnegut was wrong, that his tool is amazing. After that, we will have one more week of story models where we look at some other models. And then we will get to our next tribute, Kevin J. Anderson and Rebecca Mesta. Then we'll be talking about specifically about science, getting into what happens in free fall and spin gravity and how it can kill you. Will be 26 will be marketing for introverts. Again, that will need some serious upgrade because I did this for FireCon 2, I think. That was the FireCon where I wasn't there. I was, but it was a tornado came through the whole country right about the time I was supposed to be flying. So I was like 18 hours delayed in getting there. And by the time I arrived, my class was already running this workshop for me because they had smart people who could talk to each other about how they were doing marketing. On November 2nd, we'll be learning from improv. In November 9th, we'll be talking about openings. November 16th, story strategies. 23rd, we're back to science with orbits and transfers. Again, a couple of my books. If you find this is interesting and would like to learn more, I know that some of you already have at least one of these. Not a requirement, but if you want to, I think I have a lot more than I can say in 4 hours in the book on the left. And the book on the right is full of bad movie jokes from the 80s, mostly from the 80s. And who doesn't need more bad movie jokes? Questions? All right. That is my slide that is copied from last week. So that should not be, obviously, this is not panning for gold. This is making story models 1. I'll fix that in the edit.
Martin, I was going to ask something real quick. On the very first couple of slides when you had the, if you could you go back there real quick actually? One, just because I was trying to take notes. And because you basically had where there was like an everything diagram, and then there was also the ones where we kind of we split everything off into where we made it much more simpler because you can't fit everything on a page. And what it kind of reminded me of was when we talk about how people write different arcs of a story at different times, and then they merge those things together. Is that something that you've seen people do before? So like And so like instead of, so you have your simple, you simplify things. I think the way I do things, I could make my everything diagram, and then to organize my writing, separate everything out, box it out, make it simple, but then write the story of Superman with Krypto, right? Write the story of Superman with Lois, and then write the story and so on. And then at the end, merge them all together. I know people do things different ways, but that just seems to me like a way to get after it.
That could certainly work. Your everything diagram is sort of a visual high level outline in graphical form, and then you start fleshing that out. There's a model that I haven't looked at a lot. It used to be really popular. I don't hear much about it lately in like the last few years, but it was hearing a lot about it 10 or so years ago, called the snowflake model, which was sort of something like that. You might want to look into the snowflake model if that's your way of thinking, because the snowflake model, if you're familiar with sort of the fractal math of snowflakes, that if you take a snowflake, it's roughly a six-pointed star. And then as you look at each point, you see more detail. And then you look at the detail, you see more detail, and so on. The snowflake method is about, you start out with a one sentence of what's my story. And then you turn that one sentence into a paragraph. And then you turn that paragraph into things that happen. And you are taking and expanding and expanding and expanding. So you're starting with a goal of what you think this is about, and you are slowly fleshing that out. So you might do sort of a snowflake of, do the high level everything diagram so you know the big outer structure, and then you dive in.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'll look that up. Thank you.
Mhm. Other questions? All right. In that case, I've stopped the share. I want to thank you all for joining. I hope that I gave you some things to think about. This is one of those things that is, I've been doing it, like Dave said, for so long that for me, it's not even second nature. It's practically first nature. Not that I do it on every story, but when I need to do it, it happens naturally because I've been doing it in the software side since 1998. God, I'm old. Um, and so this way of thinking through problems visually and all of these techniques are so deep in my back brain that I don't even know how to explain I'm doing them. That's what I have to do now. And so the instructor in me has to go back and say, let's walk you through an example of how you would do this and what benefit I'm getting out of it, as opposed to, well, I need a goal diagram. I'll just do a goal diagram here and look for what the conflicts are in the goals. I don't have in this workshop, and maybe I'll try to add it in next week, because this workshop is an older version of this material. I don't have what happens when my goals conflict with your goals and how we draw the pictures of that conflict. That's something I came up with later and is in the book, but it's not in the slides here. So I'll try to make sure I touch on that. Other questions? All right. I hope this has been helpful and giving you things to think about, and hope to see you all next week.